This is behavioural economics on a post-it, number 3. Probability weighting, sometimes called probability transformation, but we'll call it probability weighting here. Probability weighting actually has, what I'm going to talk about in this post-it, has a very long history that subsequently has become very influential in the behavioural economics field. What I'll talk about in the first sort of observations of what's called probability weighting that I'll explain in a moment, I think they were reported even in the late 1940s, which is actually not that long after, only a few years after sort of modern rational choice theory, at least rational choice theory in situations of risk and uncertainty was first developed. Anyway, what this little diagram that I've drawn here indicates is that we've got a representation of what's called objective probability, or mathematical probability. You could call it mathematical probability. Probabilities as they're given on the horizontal axes here, going from 0 all the way to 1. Sometimes you can give it in percentage terms, so 0 to 100%, or probability terms 0 to 1. And then we've got a representation of subjective, or sometimes called psychological probability, on the vertical axis, which also goes from 0 to 1. Now, in standard economics and standard rational choice theory, subjective probability, the way that people process probabilities when they're given them, should be equal to the objective probabilities that are given to them. So, for example, if somebody, say, was faced with, say, a 20% or a 0.2 probability, they should process that subjectively in their minds as a 20% or a 0.2 probability. If they were given an 80% probability of something, or sorry, a 0.8 or an 80% probability of something happening, they should process that as an 80% or 0.8 probability of that thing happening, right? So they process it exactly as the probability is given. And if they do that, then people would essentially be on this kind of diagonal, 45-degree diagonal dash line here. Right, that's what they would be on. Now, in studies, in many empirical studies now, what's been observed is that people don't process probabilities psychologically or subjectively in that way. Often people tend to overweight small probabilities and underweight large probabilities. So just hypothetically, for example, somebody might process, say, a 10% chance of something happening as a sort of 15% chance of that thing happening. They overweight small probabilities and they underweight large probabilities, as I've said a moment ago. So they might process a 90% chance of something happening as an 85% chance of that thing happening, hypothetically, right? So what you would get, what's called a probability function, probability curve, would be kind of like this backward S, this inverse S, a backward S line here. Now, across studies, the point at which, when people overweight small probabilities and underweight large probabilities, there'll be a point where they do subjectively weight the objective probability as that objective probability is given. It will cross the 45-degree line, essentially, their subjective probability curve. And that varies, the point at which that occurs varies across studies, but very generally speaking, we could sort of say on average it occurs somewhere around 40% mark, or 0.4 probability of something happening. Right. Now it's a very interesting phenomena for trying to understand everyday decisions that people make. So, for example, if people do overweight small probabilities, this might be a partial explanation, at least, for why people both sometimes choose to engage in risk. They like taking risks, but at the same time, that same individual, in other circumstances, dislikes risks and pays some money to try to avoid risk, or at least ameliorate the worst effects of something going wrong. So the fact that people sometimes, the same person might both like risk in some contexts and dislike risks in other contexts cannot really be explained very well by standard economics or standard rational choice theory. But it might be explained by this, if you like, behavioural economic finding that people overweight small probabilities. So, for example, people might overweight the probability of winning the lottery, right? In which case they might pay for a lottery ticket. They pay to engage in risk. They engage in what's called risk-loving behaviour. Right? Overweight the small probability of winning the lottery might be a partial explanation for why people buy lottery tickets. That same person might take out insurance on all sorts of aspects of their life, appliance insurance, for instance. So in that sense, they're paying to try to ameliorate the worst effects of a bad thing happening. They might be overweighting the small probability that something bad would be happening, in which case they're trying to pay to avoid the risk in some sense. They engage in risk-averse behaviours. So probability weighting, the overweighting of small probabilities, might explain why people engage in those two different types of risk attitudes, right? Now, the last thing I'll say here is that probability itself, thinking about specific probabilities, is quite a modern phenomena, really, isn't it? You'd think. So, if you imagine our hunter-gatherer ancestors, it's likely that they didn't, walk out their rooms or their caves or wherever they lived, their settlements each morning and think, there's a 27% chance of rain today, or there's a 13% chance that I'll catch some prey today, right? They probably just thought about it in terms of likelihoods, very general likelihoods. So this idea that we kind of can process probabilities, mathematical probabilities, is perhaps quite a modern consideration anyway. It might be that if people thought about general likelihoods, the implication may be that people are relatively pessimistic when they're thinking about small probabilities of bad things or small likelihoods of bad things happening. So they overweight the likelihood of something bad happening. They're pessimistic, but they're optimistic when they're thinking about smaller likelihoods of good things happening. And on the converse, when they're thinking about large likelihoods of good and bad things happening, if they're underweighting the likelihood of a good thing happening, when that thing is likely to happen, they're relatively pessimistic about good things happening, but relatively optimistic about large likelihoods of bad things happening. Okay. Now, as I said, just to finish, probability weighting has had a prominent influence on the development of behavioural economics, and I will talk about those things a little bit more in further post-it notes.